I'm Cyrus Vahidi. I'm from the Center for Digital Music in London. I completed this work with my colleagues at DAFx20in22 in Nantes in the earlier part of this year. I'm presenting differentiable time-frequency scattering on GPU. So I'll be talking today about the contributions of this paper, which is a differentiable and GPU-enabled implementation of time-frequency scattering. And in particular, I'll be emphasizing experiments and applications which are relevant to future use of time-frequency scattering and demonstrate its potential for machine listening. So I'll be showing scale rate visualizations of time-frequency scattering, our experiments with representation of similarity between signals containing spectrotemporal modulations, deep musical instrument classification with time-frequency scattering, and texture resynthesis. So firstly, I need to talk about, explain the concept of scattering to you. So the scattering transform is fundamentally based on wavelets, the wavelet transform. So the scattering transform is a multi-layered transformation, and at the first layer, we compute wavelet convolution with a signal using a wavelet filter bank, and we get what we call the wavelet scaleogram, which in music information retrieval terms, people like to call the constant Q transform. And in classification tasks, invariance to time shifts is a desirable property, and an operator that brings local invariance to shifts in time is low-pass averaging. But when we do low-pass averaging, we smooth the spectrum over in time, so we lose discriminability in these higher frequency modulations in amplitude. So before averaging, we take another wavelet transformation at every frequency subband to get the second order wavelet modulus transform. And we are able to capture the modulation spectrum of each wavelet subband. And then we can do averaging again to get the second order time scattering transformation. And we have both features which modulation spectrum features, which are invariant to time shifts, and first order spectral features, which are invariant to time shifts. So the scattering transform is basically multiple orders of wavelet transform, nonlinearity, and averaging. And yes, this is like a convnet, we like to say that. Yeah, so it's like a multi-layered wavelet convolutional neural network where nothing's learned, no filters are learned. We use a fixed wavelet filter bank to decompose a signal. This brings me towards spectrotemporal modulation representations that are studied quite extensively in auditory neuroscience. And these computational representations idealize how sound is encoded in the auditory cortex. And this idealization came about from auditory neuroscientists probing the mammalian primary cortex in response to controlled stimuli like ripples and chirps and so on. And these representations have been studied for their ability to explain aspects of musical timbre perception and human speech perception. And at their core, they are composed of two-dimensional wavelets that are applied to a time-frequency image to analyze the time-frequency domain at multiple scales and rates. And recent work has also shown that they explain, this representation can be used for as a surrogate of human perception to explain human judgments of timbre dissimilarity, which means these representations have huge potential for music signal processing, but there's a few problems. They're inefficient, they're highly cumbersome, and there's a huge number of coefficients, and they're pretty slow to compute. They're not differentiable, which has precluded their use in lots of deep learning-based tasks. And they're not GPU-enabled, which follows the same point. So yeah, they've seen limited use in music information retrieval and representation learning, despite great potential. So now to time-frequency scattering. I've outlined the scattering transform, but this paper focuses on time-frequency scattering, which is also an idealization of spectrotemporal modulation representations. in the auditory cortex. So much like the time scattering transform, we compute the wavelet scalegram from a signal by convolving the signal with a wavelet filter bank. But then time frequency scattering uses two-dimensional filters in the time frequency domain, which vary in their scale across both time and frequency, and have directionality in terms of along the frequency axis. And by applying these two-dimensional filters to the wavelet scalegram, we can extract spectrotemporal modulations from signals, which we can interpret in terms of frequential modulation scales and temporal modulation rates, yielding the second-order time-frequency scattering transformation. So we can interpret these filters, like I've said, in terms of their temporal modulation rate, their selectivity to temporal modulation rate in the signal, frequential modulation scale, and the spin, which determines whether the frequential modulation is upward or downward. So, an example of a signal and how we can analyze it with time-frequency scattering. Let's hope we can hear this. So this signal is an exponential chirp mixed with a pure sinusoid and a pulse. Yeah, sound settings. Extra ion, HDMI. Let's go. Nope. I think it's on my end. Yeah. Yeah, Extron, HDMI. I'll play from my laptop. Hopefully you can all hear. Oh, there's a jack cable. Oh, here. Oh, no. All right. Let's hope this doesn't hurt. So, pretty cool signal. We got all kinds of spectrotemporal variability, pure tone, no spectrotemporal variability, chirp. And these plots on the left are the impulse response of the two-dimensional wavelet filters that are applied at the second layer of the transformation. Along this direction, we get increasing selectivity to temporal modulation, and we get increasing selectivity to frequential modulation. And along this axis, we can capture joint spectral and temporal modulations. So we can see the chirp is captured by these sort of spinned and joint spectrotemporal modulations, where we have both amplitude modulation and frequency modulation along time. The sinusoid is sort of an impulse on the frequency axis. So when we do frequential scattering along the frequential axis, we get a response at every frequency in the frequential filter bank. And likewise, along time for the impulse, we get energy at every frequency in temporal modulation. And what's interesting is that these coefficients are able to separate out each of these simultaneous signals with distinct spectrotemporal modulation characteristics. So our first experiment was to assess whether we can represent spectrotemporal modulations in signals with various acoustic representations. So we created a synthesizer that generates signals that only vary in their spectrotemporal modulation content. So this is a signal which defines a carrier sinusoid, a modulator sinusoid, which creates a tremolo effect. And we modulate the carrier's fundamental frequency exponentially, and its speed is defined by this chirp rate parameter. So for each of these parameters, we sample 16 values, and we can get a data set from the synthesizer of 4,096 signals. And we want to assess whether similarity relationships in acoustic representations reflect similarity in terms of these three synthesis parameters, which are the three factors of variability in this synthesized data set. Oh, here's what it sounds like. Sorry. So we pretty much just have a star center frequency, a chirp rate, and a modulation rate. So in each of these plots, the color map indicates increasing values for each of these three parameters. And we ideally like to see a three-dimensional mesh, three-dimensional Cartesian mesh in which each of the three principal components disentangle one of these synthesis parameters. So in MFCCs, we see that the representation is confused by amplitude modulation rates. Time scattering, we see a 2D mesh. Again, amplitude modulation isn't recovered in the face of joint frequency modulation. Time frequency scattering, we see this beautiful 3D mesh in which the three factors of variation are disentangled onto the three principal components of the manifold embedding. OpenL3, a deep feature extractor, we see a similar case to MFCCs and time frequency scattering. And also for the STRF, which is a representation from auditory psychology, which is designed to extract spectrotemporal modulations from signals, does not seem to represent similarity between amplitude modulation rates. So now on to musical instrument classification. We designed a two-dimensional convnet to perform musical instrument classification on a 3D structured joint time frequency scattering tensor. We use the Medley Solos database, which is a challenging data set due to its class imbalance and limited annotated training data. Previous benchmarks, 78% accuracy with joint time frequency scattering and shallow linear models. So this is the first instance of using time frequency scattering in interface with a learned convolutional net. And we see with our hybrid JTFS convnet, we exceed previous benchmarks, and we exceed the performance of other time frequency feature extractors like the constant Q transform and scattering just a long time. Our final experiment was texture resynthesis, which was to assess whether, from a representation which performs averaging a long time to obtain invariance to time shifts, what information can be recovered about the signal. And this task aims to reconstruct a target signal from noise using a loss function between the scattering, a distance between the scattering coefficients of the target and the scattering coefficients of the estimated signal. And this signal is estimated by iterative additive updates to noise using the gradient of this loss. So our target signal is a bird chirp. Which contains this sense of rhythm, it contains chirps, it contains harmonics. And we run this algorithm to resynthesize the signal from both time scattering coefficients and time frequency scattering coefficients with a pretty large averaging scale, almost half a second. So time scattering, oh, that was time frequency scattering. Time scattering, we see that, yeah, the signal's not so intelligible. We can see the amplitude modulation profiles in each band is a kind of retained, but the onset synchronicity of the partials not retained. Time frequency scattering, we can see that the reconstructed signal much more perceptually resembles the target. We get this onset synchronicity, and these events sort of stream into an object that sounds like a bird. So to summarize, we showed that time frequency scattering, our differentiable implementation of time frequency scattering, is able to represent variability in spectrotemporal modulations, unlike similarly designed representations. It's a portable feature extractor that can be used for musical instrument classification with modern deep learning frameworks with limited data. It can serve as a differentiable operator for audio texture synthesis. And in terms of future work, we're really looking to exploit the applications where a differentiable representation is of interest, such as audio synthesis, similarity metrics and distance functions, knowledge distillation, and parametric scattering filter banks where we can learn the parameters of the scattering filter bank. So in order to reproduce this work going forward, the Kimatio package will be releasing time frequency scattering in the next release. We've just released version 0.3. You can replicate the results of this paper via this QR code. And yeah, all the experimental code is available at this URL. And you can use a unstable nightly version of time frequency scattering if you install Kimatio from source. Cool, that's all.
Great, great. So, any questions from Cyrus? At the back? Yeah.
First of all, great talk and great work. So my question was with respect to the audio textures that you played towards the end.
Yeah.
So right now you played bird chirps in sequence. So have you worked with like other audio textures like say rain or clapping or things with like more summary statistics that need to be represented in the spectrotemporal modulations?
Mm-hmm. Have you?
We did some resonances experiments on also electronic music compositions with, but not with this type of. I think what's interesting is some kind of signals with the spectrotemporal modulation patterns and aligned partials. But these resonances results are similar to what we have right now.
Yeah, actually, now it's come to my mind. I think previous work with time scattering did more stuff on environmental textures. But time frequency scattering the resynthesis is best shown off with stuff that contains frequential modulation, which there isn't much in raindrops and stuff. But there's other works, music composition. There's been records released with time frequency scattering resynthesis that was presented at this conference. Vincent Lostanlen, Florian Hecker, 4 years ago. But I think the raindrop case is probably a bit more simple. But it's cool. Try it out, please.
All right. Other questions? Anybody? Sebastian in the middle here.
Thank you very much. Just for my understanding, so the differentiability, this is just an implementation thing, or do you need to do anything on a, let's say, mathematical level to make it?
So, this is a great question. It is asked many times. So, if you think about we exploit PyTorch's AutoGrad basically for these experiments. In MATLAB, it would take and previous implementations, it would take substantial effort out the box to get gradients out of the operations. But also, we want to emphasize the fact that this representation, which is analogous to models of processing in the auditory cortex, is differentiable, while other models aren't. They use IIR filters, the STRF is not differentiable and would require a modification, which is a substantial benefit of this, although it removes a lot of the operations of modeling the auditory system. The main building blocks are there, and the main idealization is there, which makes it more appealing for deep learning, representation learning, and loss functions. Yeah.
Okay.
You can backpropagate gradients through the representation, much like I don't know, a sinusoid is a differentiable operation, and DDSP uses sinusoids.
Okay, so but the time frequency scattering in its kind of pure formulation is mathematically differentiable.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Need to change that.
Exactly.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
first.
Hi, really cool talk. A lot of what you talked about reminded me of something called the common fate transform.
Yeah.
Extension, the multi-resolution common fate transform. I was curious if you had any comments on just what you just showed and those ideas.
Yeah, I've read a little bit about the multi-resolution common fate transform. I remember there was someone called Fatima Pishtadian, I think did source separation with it, and then Fabian Stota did some source separation with it. I've not scrutinized those representations, but at their core, they compute two-dimensional like STFTs on some time frequency image, which is what we do here jointly before taking the modulus. So I also see a connection to we don't call it the common fate transform. I think the common fate transform gets its name from the fact that the auditory system is believed to do sort of streaming and grouping of like frequency components in the time frequency domain based on common amplitude and frequency modulation profiles, right? So what joint time frequency scattering will do is it analyzes each frequency subband with the same set of filters. Those filters are shared across frequency locations. And if you, say, have a harmonic signal where each of the harmonics has common amplitude modulation and frequency modulation trajectories, each of those subbands will have the same response at each of those, the corresponding modulation filters describing that amplitude modulation profile. So those frequency locations, their response in time frequency scattering will be correlated. So there is quite a lot of interest in like researching, like trying to do learn things about common fate or extract knowledge about common fate with time frequency scattering. And it is, I think it benefits, time frequency scattering benefits from being really mathematically grounded in wavelet theory and being a multi-scale, multi-resolution transformation and handling all kinds of things like subsampling, periodic boundary effects, which minimizes artifacts. And the STRF also, I think, has connections to common fate. So I think there is a interest to research these kind of things in the scope of source separation, as has been done with the multi-resolution common fate transform, which was designed to be invertible because it did source separation in the sort of spectrotemporal modulation domain, but needed to invert to the time domain.
There's another question there, yeah?
Okay. Since this initial representation seems to be quite closely correlated to how the auditory cortex represents audio data, if I've
Maybe
understood this correctly.
Yeah, that's what we like to think. I mean, it resembles the computational DSP transformations that they design in auditory neuroscience. Yeah.
Okay. In that case, do you know of anyone who has tried to then just strap that back into some kind of a synthesis engine via a brain-computer interface?
I'm sorry, I'm not laughing at the question. I just find that funny. No. A brain-computer interface? No. But maybe check out Shihab Sharma or something. I haven't kept up to date on that stuff. But I don't know. No, I don't.
Okay,
that sounds cool, though.
I'll come pester you for the name that you just
The
mentioned.
name. I'll write down some names. Yeah, I haven't gone so deep, but this is a nice narrative for the research. But that sounds cool. Nonetheless, I just analyze music signals.